By the year 1880, newspapers across the American Southwest no longer wrote of him as rumor. His name appeared in arrest warrants, coroner's reports, and territorial correspondence. He was already counted among the dead by some editors, yet census tallies and jail ledgers confirmed otherwise. Contemporary records indicate that Henry McCarty, also known as William H. Bonney and most often remembered as Billy the Kid, was still alive. In early 1880, county officials in Lincoln County, New Mexico Territory reviewed accumulated death inquests connected to the long and unresolved violence of the Lincoln County War. The names of the deceased were known. What troubled officials was how frequently the same man appeared across unrelated incidents, sometimes as suspect, sometimes as witness, often as the last known presence before gunfire. Sheriff logs from the territory suggest hesitation. Warrants were drafted, but not promptly served. Deputies resigned. By the year 1880, newspapers across the American Southwest no longer wrote of him as rumor. His name appeared in arrest warrants, coroner's reports, and territorial correspondence. He was already counted among the dead by some editors, yet census tallies and jail ledgers confirmed otherwise. Contemporary records indicate that Henry McCarty, also known as William H. Bonney and most often remembered as Billy the Kid, was still alive. In early 1880, county officials in Lincoln County, New Mexico Territory reviewed accumulated death inquests connected to the long and unresolved violence of the Lincoln County War. The names of the deceased were known. What troubled officials was how frequently the same man appeared across unrelated incidents, sometimes as suspect, sometimes as witness, often as the last known presence before gunfire. Sheriff logs from the territory suggest hesitation. Warrants were drafted, but not promptly served. Deputies resigned. Posse formations dissolved before departure. The law, fragmented and underfunded, was facing a man who had survived multiple armed confrontations, escaped custody more than once, and maintained local protection through alliances that records only partially explain. Archived newspapers from the Las Vegas Gazette and Santa Fe Daily New Mexican in 1879 to 1880 describe him in restrained but unmistakable terms. Dangerous, elusive, not to be approached lightly. The language is notable not for exaggeration, but for caution. Reporters of the era avoided embellishment when legal liability loomed. The disturbing discovery was not a single corpse or crime scene. It was the realization, evident in paperwork, not legend, that the mechanisms of law enforcement themselves were adapting to avoid direct contact with one man. By 1880, he was not merely pursued, he was anticipated, and often he was allowed to pass. The United States of 1880 was not yet a finished nation. In the Western territories, authority existed on paper long before it existed in practice. Nowhere was this more visible than in New Mexico Territory, where federal law, territorial statute, and local power rarely aligned. According to the 1880 United States Census, Lincoln County was sparsely settled, with population scattered across ranches, trading posts, and small town centers. Roads were unpaved, communication depended on horseback and irregular telegraph lines. Law enforcement coverage was thin, often consisting of a single sheriff and a handful of deputies responsible for hundreds of square miles. Territorial court records indicate that economic power preceded legal authority. Large cattle operations, mercantile houses, and land speculators exerted influence over judges, juries, and sheriffs alike. In this environment, law was not absent but selective. Arrests were shaped by alliances. Prosecutions depended on which interests were threatened. Contemporary 19th century accounts describe a region still recovering from the Lincoln County War, a conflict rooted in competition over contracts, cattle, and political appointments. Though the violence officially subsided by late 1879, its effects lingered into 1880. Men who had taken sides remained armed. Witnesses were reluctant to testify. Courts inherited cases that no longer had cooperative participants. Newspapers of the period reflect this instability. Reports from the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican and Las Vegas Gazette show careful wording when discussing violence. Killings were reported without emphasis, arrests were noted without optimism. Editorials increasingly focused on order as an abstract goal rather than a practical reality. Lawmen in the territory were poorly compensated and often unpaid for months. Sheriff expense claims filed with territorial offices reveal requests for ammunition, horses, and additional manpower that were frequently denied or delayed. As a result, enforcement relied on personal judgment rather than strict procedure. Within this social order, certain individuals operated in the margins between legality and protection. Men associated with powerful ranching interests were tolerated despite known acts of violence. Others, without such backing, were pursued relentlessly. The difference was not crime, but position. It was in this fractured system that Billy the Kid remained active in 1880. His survival was not an anomaly, it was a symptom. He understood the boundaries of authority better than many sworn officers. He knew where warrants ended, where loyalties shifted, and where the law hesitated. Historians of the era suggest that fear did not stem from superstition or exaggeration. It arose from recognition. The law recognized itself in the mirror he held up and found its reach wanting. By 1880, the American West was not governed by certainty. It was governed by negotiation, exhaustion, and restraint. In such a place, a man did not need to defeat the law. He only needed to outlast it. By 1880, Billy the Kid no longer appeared in records as an isolated offender. His name surfaced alongside officials, businessmen, and law officers, bound together by unresolved obligations and unfinished agreements dating back to the Lincoln County War. Territorial court documents list him as both defendant and potential witness. In several instances, depositions note his presence without follow-up testimony. This absence is not explained in the records. What remains is the pattern: cases stalled, hearings postponed, and charges left unresolved. Correspondence from Governor Lew Wallace, preserved in territorial archives, confirms that Billy the Kid was considered valuable to the state, not as a criminal, but as a source of testimony. Wallace's letters reference negotiations for cooperation in exchange for leniency. Though no formal pardon was finalized, the existence of such negotiations altered Billy the Kid's legal status in practice, if not in law. Sheriff Pat Garrett, appointed in late 1880, inherited a situation already compromised. Arrest logs indicate Garrett pursued methodical containment rather than immediate confrontation. Jail registers show that Billy the Kid was held under heightened security, yet guarded by men drawn from the same communities he once rode with. The escalation during this period was not marked by increased bloodshed. Instead, it appeared in administrative strain. Deputies requested transfers, guards filed complaints, county expenses rose without corresponding enforcement success. Archived newspapers began referring to Billy the Kid less frequently by name and more by implication. Phrases such as "the accused party" or "the prisoner" replaced earlier language. This shift suggests not restraint, but fatigue. By the end of 1880, the law was no longer reacting to each incident individually. It was managing a presence it could not easily remove. The most revealing aspect of the 1880 record is not what is written, but what is no longer said. Earlier newspaper accounts had named Billy the Kid directly. By mid-1880, editorials reduced their coverage. Killings associated with him were reported briefly or placed deep within columns. Public outrage, once vocal, receded into procedural language. Jail records from Lincoln County confirm repeated custody under guard, yet transportation orders were delayed or revised. Requests for reinforced escorts appear in expense claims, many marked as unpaid. Guard rosters show frequent changes, suggesting reluctance rather than routine rotation. Court calendars from the period list hearings that were scheduled and quietly removed. No official explanation accompanies these omissions. Historians reviewing these documents note a pattern consistent with institutional avoidance rather than incompetence. The silence extended beyond the press and courts. Territorial correspondence shows fewer directives issued regarding Billy the Kid despite his conviction. Orders emphasized containment, not pursuit. In 1880, the law did not collapse, it withdrew. The system preserved itself by minimizing exposure to a figure who tested its authority without directly challenging it. The documents reveal an administration choosing survival over resolution. Billy the Kid would be killed in July 1881. Yet the consequences of 1880 shaped the manner of that ending. By the time of his death, the territorial government had altered its approach to enforcement. Sheriffs were granted broader discretion. Armed authority increased. Negotiation with fugitives declined. The aftermath did not restore confidence. Instead, it hardened institutions. Laws became less flexible. Pardons grew rarer. The tolerance once extended out of necessity was no longer permitted. Historical analysis suggests that Billy the Kid's true impact lies not in the number of deaths attributed to him, but in how clearly he exposed the weaknesses of territorial governance. He did not overwhelm the law through force alone. He outlasted it through understanding. In the years that followed, his name entered folklore, but the records remain colder. They show hesitation, delay, and restraint. In 1880, there lived a man the law was afraid of, not because he was invincible, but because he revealed what the law could not yet be. The silence he left behind endures in ink, ledgers, and unanswered gaps.